Analog horror is a recent subgenre of horror. There are a few tropes of the subgenre, such as the videos usually taking place in the 1960s to 1990s. Analog horror are horror short videos where they try to recreate it through analog technology, such as VHSs and CRT TVs. Just like everything else, there are amazing analog horror series, such as the Mandela Catalog and Marble Hornets. Then there's the Squirmpus and McGrimpus FNAF tapes, and by extension, the Baddington remakes. But it also has its downs, like June 6th, 2006 Hijacking and Urban Spook. As a subgenre, I'm kind of mixed on analog horror, because I really like things like No Through Road and the previously mentioned FNAF tapes. But at the same time, most of the genre is just so derivative of each other that it's so hard to actually sit down and watch it, because it feels like if you've watched one, you've pretty much watched every analog horror video. So I decided to go over the 5 best and the 5 worst of the analog horror genre. I will be going over both series and one-offs in this video. For the series, I'll give a lot less detail because there's just more to talk about, so I'm gonna speedrun it. One-offs I'll give a bit more detail to, and then before we get into that, I do want to go over the honorable and dishonorable mentions for the best and the worst, respectively. Dishonorable mention number 1 will have to be The Painter, aka Urban Spook. It was terrible. The only reason why it's not on the actual list itself is because everyone would have seen that coming. So if it wasn't as talked about, then I would have put it on the actual list. But I also feel like the art is good enough to avoid that as well. So moving on to that, we've got dishonorable mention number 2, that being Sneaky Snack Bar. The reason why Sneaky Snack Bar is not on the list is because it was the creator's first analog horror attempt. So I don't want to put it on there because no one's first project will ever be that good, you know? My third and final dishonorable mention will be the Boiled One phenomenon, made by Dr. Nowhere. I really like Dr. Nowhere's videos, so you might be wondering, why is the Boiled One phenomenon here? It's simple. I did find it to be really boring. I like the design of Fen228 for the most part, but in this shot he looks a bit like Morticia from the Addams Family. The honorable mention for the good will have to be Greylock from Rob Gavigan. Greylock is an incredibly well-made horror series. It's one of the few series that genuinely managed to scare me multiple times, such as the scare with the glove and the Thing-inspired abomination and the TF2 tape. My biggest problem with this series is the over-reliance of jump scares. I don't mind the jump scares too much because they do get me for the most part, but I just feel like it relies on it too much when analog horror should rely on it a bit less than this does. Honorable mention number 2 goes to Vita Carnis, made by Dorian Quilloy. It is on here for the exact same reason that Greylock is. It's just way too popular to the point where it's going to be expected. My third and final honorable mention will be Harmony and Horror, made by Baddington. I'd honestly recommend watching all of the videos. The first of the non-canonical ones, the 2 for season 2, the 2 episodes of the season 1 remaster, and the 24 episodes of the original season 1. But with all of that out of the way, let's get into the number 5 worst. That being the South Park analog horror. Now you might be thinking, a South Park analog horror? That isn't scary. And you are absolutely right. It is not scary in the slightest. And I'm pretty sure the creator, Beyond Birth, had stolen a lot of fan art. I say this confidently because I do think he stole one, and I'll get to that. Alright, so I'm going to go into these now because as I'm recording this, I'm just now realizing all of my positives, that being the visuals, might not even be applicable because I think he stole all of these images from other places. Let's talk about the thumbnail for the first video, which I'll put on screen now. You can see down here, this image is credited as being published onto DeviantArt by Slundy Alex on May 11, 2015. And this is the description of the very first episode, as you can see right here. South Park Analog Horror stands grieving. I do not see a credit to Slundy Alex, not even a mention of his username. I scrolled through the comments, and even then I also could not find credit to him, so it has to have been stolen. It's even worse because the description on screen is of a most amazing top 10, one of the biggest slop content farms on all of YouTube. As you could see here, it says most thumbnail has this amazing artist, and it credits the Slundy Alex. No, it's bad when a fucking slop channel is able to actually credit the artist where you got your scare from. Better than a one-man team. I do want to state the stand image is the only one I'm actually confident in saying he stole, as I cannot find any others, but I'm really bad at research. So if you do know of any others, please do leave it in the comments for me. Let's move on to the number 5 best analog horror series. The number 5 best analog horror series is Monument Mythos, made by Manticore. It's basically an alternative reality take on what if a bunch of monsters inhabited American monuments and the American government is now sacrificing them. I honestly really like this series up until a certain point. I stopped liking it after season 2. It just became really hard to watch after that. Our number 4 worst analog horror series is the Jurassic Park analog horror series. To give this series credit, there is no stolen fan art. But it's not scary. It's honestly just extremely goofy. Honestly, that's just a massive shame, as I feel like this idea has a lot of promise. Having an analog horror series based off of dinosaurs is a genuinely terrifying premise, but it just fails, unfortunately. My number 4 favorite analog horror series is Great Choice. This is a one-off video, so I'll give a brief explanation of it. It takes the form of a Red Lobster commercial. In it, you get 30 shrimp for $10. At first, the video just seems to be a pretty normal commercial, but like in Groundhog Day, the commercial starts to repeat. The only one who notices it is our main character. Eventually, after stabbing the waiter, she falls through the window into a AAA meeting, and the waiter just slams on the window yelling, "Great choice." I know that's not the best description. I'm not that great at describing it, but it is a genuinely great analog horror series. It's a unique one, and it's also a metaphor for your mind on drugs, which does add to the horror factor. There's no cheesy jump scares or anything. It's honestly just a realistic take in an analog horror style. My number 3 worst analog horror is The Walton Files. It's often considered to be one of the best analog horror series, and I'm just so confused by this sentiment. I find this series to be honestly pretty boring. I cannot separate it from Five Nights at Freddy's. Probably because it did start off as a Five Nights at Freddy's fan game, but it still does harm it. I also just don't find the Walton Files to be all that scary. I saw this 2-hour-long video about why it's the most terrifying analog horror series, and I'm like, really? Like, no offense to that guy, but the Walton Files of all things? The 3rd best analog horror is The Kid in the Camera. The Kid in the Camera is a one-off video that follows Caleb, a boy who got a camera. One day he broke it and was visited by a creature called the Kipsonid. It lures him to a house. At the end of the video, all that's left of Caleb is his feet that were cut off. The rest of him was never found again. Everything about this video is amazing. The narrator's voice, the art style, especially the ending. Just finding his feet cut off, not knowing what happened to him, is genuinely bone-chilling. My second least favorite analog horror series is The Man in the Suit. This has a lot of the same problems as the Suitmation's Trial. It's just not as goofy as that series, and it's slightly better, but I still would not call this good by any means either. The second best analog horror video is Mango 67432110614 1987. It was made by the Dark Lord okay. And despite it being a bit of a long video, it is 13 minutes long, I would still genuinely recommend that you check this video out. It is absolutely depressing and terrifying hearing the main character cry at the end. My number one least favorite is the Suitmation trials. I'm a fan of the Godzilla franchise, which is why videos like this and The Man in the Suit disappoint me so much, because there is so many cool things you could do with a Godzilla analog horror, but this was just way too goofy. It is everything that you take The Man in the Suit with, but then you make it worse, because this is just infinitely more goofy to me. It's not terrible per se, it's just really disappointing. The best analog horror series on the platform, in my opinion, is Dreams of an Insomniac. It's made by the YouTuber Postra, and I genuinely cannot recommend this enough. There's a 1 hour long video by a YouTuber named Manaxa. I'd recommend you watch that if you want to.